Well, hello. We're in the Leslie Evans kitchen again today, and we're going to be talking about Edward Pennant. My name's Liz Millman, and we're recording this to go on our Black History Conversations site. So I'm just going to attempt to find the find the right website. This will be fun. All right, is this the one? Let's have a look. Perhaps it's last week's. Who knows? Oh no, we've got the right one. Okay then. Right. Let me just put it on full screen and then you can see. All right then. So it's the 19th of September. So we're into the second session of Black History Conversations. And this session, we've asked Leslie Evans, if she'll share some more about her research. And this time we're going to be talking about the years that were the lifetime of Edward Pennant. Now, we've explained before that we're doing this because we want to get this background to the plantation owners as part of a bigger project called Fiwi Life. And Fiwi Life is about finding out the names and stories that we can about enslaved workers, African workers who worked on the Pennant family plantations over the years. So that's to introduce us. Learning Links International is the organisation that puts these sessions together with Simon Faringo doing the techie things, myself, Liz Millman, organising and pulling together the programme and sometimes getting organised and sometimes not. And apologies from Garrick Prayog. He's taking a break for a few weeks, but he'll be back with us soon, and I'm sure he's going to be watching what we're doing. Right, okay then. So we always do an acknowledgement at the beginning of Black History Conversations to acknowledge the just injustice of the actions taken by the British and other European countries that invaded and took possession of islands in the Caribbean Sea, as well as countries in the continents of North and South America. In addition, we also recognise the exploitation of the great continents of Africa, Asia, Australia, and so many other parts of the world in the centuries of colonialisation and ongoing exploitation. We acknowledge that this resulted in the destruction and destabilisation of so many nations, peoples, and cultures, with so many peoples enslaved. So we kind of wander around different topics and subjects, but reparations is always one that we take very seriously. And some of the activities we're involved in, Learning Links International and the North Wales Jamaica Society, we're building bridges of friendship with Clarendon in Jamaica from North Wales here. So reparations are important, and this is just to remind you that the Runnymede Trust has come out with a new report about reparations, so that's well worth reading. Okay. Now, because I live in Australia for half the time, I was really excited to hear that after nearly a decade walking the path to treaty with our communities and generations of resistance and activism from the first people, Australia's first treaty is here. So this is really good news. In the state that I stay in when I'm in Australia, it's Victoria, and this work's been going on in Victoria. So many folks there from the Aboriginal communities, and some I recognise. Okay, so the first Australia's first treaty. Um, this has been a fight going on for decades to acknowledge the truth about what was done to Aboriginal people and make sure that the Aboriginal communities have freedom and power to come up with and deliver practical solutions at a local level. I'm not going to read that all out, but you can read it again if you need to. And there's lots of good information on the internet about this. Oh, and I just popped this in because I discovered that at this very moment in time now, I think it's the um, National Museum in London is running a Zoom session on England's first colony, medieval Ireland. So, right. And then to say that Leslie and I have been talking together, and Leslie returned some really interesting information. I get a preview, you see. And she's found that there's this publication online called Historic Jamaica, and it's by Frank Kundal. And you can find it online, all 475 pages of it, and it's cram-packed full of information about the history of Jamaica. So it's a real good find. So now I'm going to hand over to Leslie Evans, and you can see her here in Bangor Archives
with the lovely Barrington.
With the lovely Barrington Richardson, Regional Director of Education in Clarendon, Jamaica, and they're at Bangor Archives. But just to remind you, this is why we're looking at this as a short series, but an ongoing series of sessions where we'll be telling the story about not only the Pennant family, but also those enslaved workers and also any other workers we can find records of. This is Penrhyn Castle. It's massive. It was built in 1826 to show off the wealth of the Pennant family when they relocated back to Britain. But I think that's for next week's story. Now, the Penrhyn papers at Bangor University Archives, where Leslie's researching, and there are also maps. So, for example, this is the map of the Denby plantation, which is pretty incredible, and we very much want to share it with our colleagues in Jamaica, and we are looking to set up the Clarendon Historical Society. Okay then, so I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to let Leslie take over for a few minutes, and then we've got a PowerPoint that Leslie's done, and folks can listen online in the future. Thank you, Leslie.
Okay. Now, last week's session started with me sort of posing an enigma, really, because I said that if Cromwell's grand design, his Western design, had been successful, I would be telling a very different story today. And that's because the first attempt they took in the West Indies to invade an island under Cromwell was in Hispaniola. Now, Hispaniola was very different to the Jamaica that they ended up in. Hispaniola had been settled for many, many years. It had slight decline going on at the time, but had of Oliver Cromwell's troops and the settlers actually managed to achieve the takeover of the island, they would have walked into a situation where sugar was already under production. And as a consequence of that, Gifford Pennant, who was the first person who went, would have immediately started to amass his wealth. As it was, as we're going to find out now, it took him quite a time to actually even get started as a plantation owner. And it took a lot of time for him to accumulate enough land to do that. Unfortunately, when he died in 1736, he had a 4-year-old son. And that was it to take over the next generation. So Gifford, as I said last week, arrived at the island and it was totally undeveloped. The Spanish had only used it as a pen for animals because they were using the animals to produce leather for their industry back at home in Spain. The first settlers were totally unprepared. I'm just filling in people who weren't here last week. Forgive me if you've heard this before. I'll keep it very brief because there's a lot to tell in this installment. So the first settlers arrived and a treaty was supposedly made, and the islanders were given 10 days to pack up their belongings and leave. They were going to be shipped off. That was what they supposed was going to happen. There were provisions. They were to supply food for the army, which was substantial, 700 odd men, some of them regular army, some of them small planters that had joined the team, as it were, when they went to the Leeward Islands. Some of them were convicts, some of them were not very nice people. As it turned out, quite a lot of them turned out to be possibly not the best caliber of person to become a planter. They were totally ill-equipped. They had no provisions, and that was why they were relying on the food that the Spanish were supposed to provide them. When the food stopped at 5 days, they quickly realized that they'd been tricked. The Spanish had packed their women, their valuable possessions, their enslaved workers, all their goods, all their chattels, and shipped them off into the mountains and beyond into the north coast. So we pick up the story, as it were, at that point, with Gifford landing there.
Excuse me. I'm just going to find the PowerPoint.
So Gifford is
Oops.
on his own, supposedly on his own. However, he must have had support from home because they hadn't really gone very well equipped, as I said. The island was not a hospitable island. It was, if they only had known it. There were plenty of fruits and vegetables that they could have eaten, but they didn't recognize them. So, because they had foolishly ransacked all the provision grounds that the Spanish had left, thinking that that might be where they had hidden the Spanish gold and silver that they couldn't find, they ransacked the plantation grounds. They ransacked the houses in Spanish Town. They ransacked the churches and erased every evidence of popery, as they called it. So that was what they started off with, virtually nothing, because they destroyed a lot of it. It took them a long time. It took them a long time to actually even begin to be settlers and planters, because the only person who really knew how to settle an island was Edward Winslow, who unfortunately had died on the journey. It took the arrival of Sir Thomas Modiford, an experienced planter from Barbados, an experienced sugar plantation owner, more to the point, to actually allow the sugar trade to begin in the island. So we're going to pick up the story of Edward from that point on. So here's a little brief nutshell of Edward. Just 4 years old, as I said, when his father died. He married Elizabeth Moore. He had at least 9 children. More about those later. He was appointed Chief Justice of Jamaica. And in 1735, only yesterday, out of the book that Liz was just telling you about, I discovered that he had declined the role of the President of the Council. Now, whether he knew at that point that his time was drawing to a close, I don't know. His will seems to suggest that he is of sound body and mind, unlike his father Gifford before him, whose will says that he was definitely sick. So why he declined that very prestigious role is up for conjecture, really, because sadly he did die the following year, and as it says there, his family played a major role in the Jamaican plantations and society and politics. So we're moving on from there. In the early days, life was pretty much made up as they went along. However, the one thing they did establish quite early on was this legislative structure, the Colonial House of Assembly. It was run by the Crown appointed governor, and they were regularly replaced by new people. And on the whole, it was an efficient system. They had their arguments with Britain because they actually wanted to run their own colonial society. They wanted to make the rules up. So they did initially. They sent the rules that they wanted back to England for the Crown to approve, and that did happen for a while. But then you'll remember, those of you that know your island very well, that there was a period when basically the pirates had control. And the House of Assembly struggled and struggled to get the power back, which eventually they did get. So in the early days, they'd formed their parishes. Each parish had a body that looked after it, and they'd formed a local militia. Now, in some of the books that I've read, this is kind of laughed at because the local militia basically was formed, as was the assembly and the parish, the vestry, and all the local administrators. They're all the local landowners. All the large plantation owners came to take those huge roles. They had vested interests in a lot of what they did, and today we would say that they ran by the Old Pals Act. You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours, basically, was how these various organizations are described in various books. But it worked for them. And as I've noticed in lots of books that I've read, the House of Assembly comes up regularly as being of a good standard, considering they're making it up basically as they go along. These are the good things that happened on the island. Particularly good news for them was when the Royal African Company's monopoly came to an end, because they hadn't really been supplying them with a lot of enslaved workers. And as the island expanded and as the sugar plantations expanded, they came to need more workers. However, you can see here the slave revolts that had always been continuing to hamper the early work still continued, and particularly close to home in Spanish Town. There, the mistress of the house and a lot of the white workers in the area were killed. On Modifa's estate in St. Catherine, 200 enslaved people had got together and caused a riot. 20 of them were executed. And on Thomas Sutton's, later, up to 200 of the enslaved workers were actually killed. Then followed this other small revolt on the north coast. However, to add to that, there were continuing wars. The 9 Years' Wars, that's the Anglo-French Wars, the War of the Spanish Succession, and the War of Austrian Succession. Now, you would kind of think that those were remote from the island, but in fact, they weren't. Because if you know the islands, they're owned between the Spanish and the French and the Dutch, the Portuguese. And these are all countries involved in these wars. And they kind of conducted guerrilla raids all around the West Indies when these wars were going on. It was very unsettling for the islands because they would carry out guerrilla attacks on the islands with the intent of disrupting plantation life. And that's exactly what happened. And it, on one or two occasions, affected the sugar production on the island. Ongoing, the British were, as you can see, always at war with France in one way or another. In addition to which, life on the island was not eased by a huge earthquake in 1692. Now, that's the very well known Port Royal earthquake, which at that time was pirate heaven. It was a thriving community where you could find any product in the world that you wanted to. The pirates were looting and bringing back things to the island to sell, to trade. It was, as I said, it was pirate heaven, and you could get anything you wanted at a price, of course. So in 1692, when the earthquake happened, it was a particularly bad time for the island. The usual trading that would go on there ceased because half of Port Royal disappeared into the sea. The ships were damaged, the wharves were damaged. Life as they knew it came to a halt during that time. To make matters worse, a huge malaria outbreak followed, and quite a lot of the island was decimated by that. Following shortly on that was the 1694 invasion by the French. They sailed into the eastern part of the island and basically destroyed up to 50 plantations. They killed a lot of the enslaved workers, but they also took 1,600 of them away. Now, all of these factors meant that export of the goods off the island was vastly disrupted. And the other disruption was the total lack of labour that was coming into the island.
And this was when Edward was about 20.
Mm-hmm.
So a really, really difficult time in terms of his time. Thanks. So we've got the great illustration here. This is quite a well-known one that shows us much about how sugar was produced. And these elements are seen clearly here in the picture.
Mm. So, as I just said, there was a great lack of labour on the island. And if there's one thing that the sugar trade needed to get the sugar trade up and running, it was labour. Sugar needed several things to be in place so the trade could flourish. It needed a good soil, it needed water, and it needed a huge labour force. It was a very labour-intensive product. And quite frankly, the English had absolutely no idea how how it grew, really. It didn't follow a typical pattern of agricultural year that they knew. So they had to learn how to produce the sugar. They had to learn how to plant it. They had to learn all that it required. It's not just a question of putting a plant into the ground and letting it grow, because the island is a tropical paradise for growth. But that means everything. That means what you want to grow and the weeds that come with it. So labour intensive in huge, huge amounts. The sugar had to be planted. It had to be manured. The plants had to be weeded. The plants had to have the rats kept at bay. To produce the manure, you needed animals. So the younger or less able members of the plantation were feeding animals grass, cutting grass to produce the sugar cane. The plantation, any plantation, needed hundreds of workers if you wanted to produce hundreds of tons of sugar. So here, as Liz said, we've got a typical picture of what goes on in the sugar process. Right at the back of the picture, you can see the rollers, which had to be maintained motion by 2 or 3 enslaved workers. In the peak time of production, the sugar cane had to be cut down and processed within 24 hours. Otherwise, it spoiled. It then had to be crushed very quickly for the same reason. So the pressure inside what is called the boiling house was intense, and accidents happened. It was very often the case that an enslaved worker had their hand or their arm trapped in the machine, and there was simply no way to get it out other than to chop the arm off. And there is evidence of 2 disfigurements in the records that I've been looking at in the archives. Once the sugar cane had been crushed, it ran through a gully into the boiler, where it was tempered with lime to make it granulate eventually. And then the juice was processed through a succession of pans that were progressively smaller and smaller and smaller, where the crust of impurities was skimmed off before it went into the pots, into the cooling house, into the curing house. The pots that you see in this picture here are not the typical ones that the sugar was kept in. The typical ones that I've seen in other pictures are rather like a flower pot with a conical top. And the sugar stayed in the curing house for some time so that it could dry, basically. When it was removed from the pot, the bottom bit and the top bit were chopped off, and that was sent off to make molasses. But the other bit was what was kept and dried for sugar. Also in the picture, you can see young lads on the floor here collecting up the cane. That's called trash that's been through the crushing machine, and that is now on its way to be a kind of manure on the ground. During the processing period, it was all hands to the pump, 24 hours of the day until the crop was in and the crop had been dealt with. There was no let up. It was very, very intensive, hard work for which many of the slaves were not prepared, really. Only the fittest workers did these jobs, and these tradesmen were the most highly valued on the plantation, next to the overseer, because the overseer, of course, had to ensure that he struck the crop at exactly the right time to make the most of the sugar that they painfully produced. Here you can see, in the period that we're looking at, initially between those two dates, that by now on the island there were 54 sugar planters. The value of their estates, how many slaves they had, and how many servants they had. Now, these were not house servants, because there were enslaved workers that did that job. These are what you call indentured servants. So people who would come from England for 3 or 4 years, they would sign up, they would agree to work for a fixed term on a plantation for a fixed sum. And those indentured workers were hoping to maybe make a little bit of money and be able to stay on the island to start a plantation. But inevitably, all of the planters had the objective of becoming absentee landlords. You can see here that there's also indigo, cotton, and unidentified plantations. I'm suspecting they might be cocoa because before sugar took over as the main crop of the island, indigo and cocoa were the two high-profile ones. Cotton's an interesting one because John, at one point, this is Edward's son when he followed on, did consider when things weren't looking too great on one of his plantations, going over to cotton. But for now, we'll stick with the sugar story. You can see here, as the years went on and the plantations become larger, more productive, how exponentially the imports increased from just 500 tons in 1669 to 6,000 in 1704. I was interested in one or two of the dips in the production, and as you can see at the bottom, there were reasons for it. the particular one at the bottom, 1690, must have caused those plantation owners, including Edward, great concern. Now, I don't know if you know what Coromantee Africans are, but they are African enslaved workers who were considered to be probably the most disruptive. They were arrogant. The English considered them arrogant, and they tried to keep the Coromantee Africans separated on the plantation so they didn't have opportunities to plot together to cause uprisings. But clearly in 1690, that hadn't worked because there was this huge uprising. So in 1690, you could see that quite a substantial drop in tonnage of production. Here you can see the huge increase in enslaved workers that enabled that increase. Between 1679 and 1888, it's particularly a huge increase. But as I said, that when the Royal African Company lost their monopoly, the private traders took on. And it was, you can see in that one category alone, the private traders brought in as many enslaved workers as the Royal African Company did. And the whole of the time they were bringing in the enslaved workers from Africa. And all the time the population was growing. Not very much, certainly not for the white. However, for the non-whites, you can see in 80 years how vastly huge the increase in the population was. Now, that was always a concern to the Jamaican Assembly. And in 1703, they brought in what they called a deficiency tax. And that was a tax that the plantation owners had to pay if they did not produce or employ white workers in a sufficient ratio to protect the islanders in case of rebellion. Now, most of the white workers simply paid the fine because it was actually cheaper and less work than trying to find white workers who would come in as indentured servants. So by the end of the century, there were hardly any indentured workers coming in, which is why they had to resort to bringing in so many enslaved workers as they did. So if this was happening in Jamaica, it was happening right the way across the West Indies as sugar became more and more in demand and less of a luxury item. As soon as people got a sweet tooth, they wanted more and more and more sugar. And that was the result of it, unfortunately, this huge increase of enslaved workers required. Now, towards the end of the year, 1699, we see the first evidence that Edward has taken control of the plantation. So what did happen between Gifford's death and Edward taking control? So in order for Gifford to survive, as he did, he must have had support from home. He had brothers, family at home in England, in Cheshire. We have no evidence of this, but he must have been supported from home because he simply was not producing any crop till late on in the time that he was there. However, there was another person who was more likely to be helping them on the ground. Now, Gifford had married a lady called Elizabeth Allwinkle. Now, when I heard that name initially, I thought, oh, I've seen that on maps. So I had a little bit of a search around and I discovered that the Allwinkles' land marched exactly with some of Gifford's. So I'm assuming that as they did in England at that time, you married your daughter to somebody else's son to keep plantations together, to keep manor houses together, to keep estates together. So I'm very much suspecting that that's what's happened here. And certainly Thomas Aldwinkle appears regularly in records later. There's some land which Thomas buys and later sells to Edward. So I suspected that he was keeping a watchful eye over the plantation for Elizabeth, his daughter, all the time her children are young. There's Edward and Elizabeth, his sister, 2 years older than him. So neither of them capable of carrying on the plantation while they were so young. So it's highly likely to me that Thomas Aldwinkle was the one that was negotiating with the attorneys, negotiating with the family back home on Elizabeth's behalf. So then in 1669, Edward takes out his first patent on the land in Clarendon. That was just 500 acres. And then 2 years later, he takes out another 534 acres. And then bit by bit, he gets purchases of land in Westmoreland and in Cave River. Now, I haven't discovered what Cave River was doing, but there were 200 acres there, so it must have been something. It may just have been another pen. However, the most significant one for me during this time is this grant of the estate of Anna Cupis, because that is the land that becomes Cupis's estate, obviously. Now, Edward seems to own it jointly with Edward Swimmer, but Edward Swimmer disappears off the scene quite quickly. So, land purchased in Clarendon, there were probably about 12 or 14 land purchases there. Some small, 54 acres was one of the very small ones, and others of a couple of hundred, 300. In Westmoreland, another couple of hundred, and Thomas River. So clearly that's Thomas River plantation that develops. And again, we've got this purchase of Coates Plantation, which is an up and running plantation, ready to go. It's already in production, as is Cupis's. So we've had a lot about land purchase. We've had a lot about different plantations. But this document here, which is an inventory made just before his death, tells us actually a great deal more. These are the main plantations. As you can see, the cave only has steers. Bullard's Pen, although it has tradesmen, has a huge amount of stock, as does Coates Pen. Crawl, no stock, 18 men. What are they doing? Main Savannah, 4, no stock, no idea what they're doing. Now, there's a significant plantation missing there, and that is Denby. In its place, we have something called Waterworks, with 16 tradesmen, 88 men, 74 women, and 8 children. Some steers. Now, I had a discussion with Liz, and the discussion went like this. This is by far the largest plantation, as was Denby. The first evidence that I've got of Denby is 1744, 8 years later. So I would like to conjecture that Waterworks became Denby.
Okay, it's fascinating.
Sorry to interrupt, Leslie.
Yes.
You said Waterworks became Denby.
I would like to conjecture that it did. Do you
Yeah,
know?
but okay. The reason why I ask, I'm seeking clarification at this point instead of waiting until you're through. There is a waterworks in Westmoreland.
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
It's waterworks in Westmoreland. Never heard of one in Clarendon.
Mm. So where is Denby in all this?
Denby still might have had another name
Yeah. So that's what I'm
because
asking.
Denby is a Welsh name, and it's we'd have to trace when the Welsh came to Jamaica because I noticed that you have St. David's, and that's on the St. Thomas side,
Mm,
and the church is still there today, St. David's Church. When St. David's was a parish, but discontinued in 1867.
mm. But my question really is, if we have all of these workers, and if you look at this page,
Yes.
do you want to go back? Oh, sorry.
I want to get rid of this green
Oh.
line. Yes, that's it. If you have a look at this, this is what was at Waterworks. So this is equipment for sugar boiling. And there is a house. If Waterworks is elsewhere, that's a debatable point. But in all of this, Denby is the plantation which is the most developed in the early days. So I would really, really be interested to know if anybody knows definitively if Waterworks became Denby or not, because I have a big question then to research when did Denby start?
Notice on your page, you have Coats and the Pen, then Spanish Town, and next to that is Westmoreland on your presentation.
Yes, but look, that's a separate issue.
Waterworks utensils.
That's Westmoreland is an additional to this list.
Okay, okay.
That is
Well,
that is what's the title of this?
this
This is all part
presentation,
of the inventory. This is
yes,
all part of the inventory. So if Waterworks is there, why isn't it down in Westmoreland?
that's the issue.
Yes. So if any of you historians out there know the answer to that question, I'd be really grateful to know it. So what we're learning from this inventory is actually quite a lot that we have questioned over time. So if this is not Denby, the house should appear down on Westmoreland, but the house,
Ah,
the furniture is up in Waterworks.
I think, sorry to interrupt again. I recall, and I would have to phone to find out sometime, that there is a place. I have friends from a place in Clarendon called Waterworks.
Oh,
Oh,
When I was at university,
nation.
I'm going to, all right, I'm going to make a call. While
right. We have joining us here, Dr. Vivian Crawford. Thank you so much, Vivian, for
I have
chit
to make a call.
because this is a really, really important element in this research. And Leslie's come across this issue that there is no record of a Denby plantation, which is, let's face it, we think the main plantation that funds were generated for the Pennant family. But there's this waterworks, which is identified as being an active place during Edward's lifetime. So we're talking about Edward now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so that's
So
fascinating. I
you're
think,
quite right, Vivian. We've got Cupis here, clearly a working plantation with its with its 1,000 sugar pots and its coppers and its basins. Bullards, no utensils, clearly a pen, but there's a house there. Well, that's a new piece of information. You don't consider usually a house going with a pen. And it's a substantial house, look. It's got an entry, a garret and closets, bed linen, etc., etc. A coach and a pen. Now, maybe that's because the animals are kept there and they harness them there. So it's just a whole new picture being revealed in this inventory. Similarly, at Coates Pen, household goods. So there's a house there. But up until now, we haven't had any evidence in any of the documentation that follows that there was ever a house there.
And interesting, Leslie, to see that there are sundries in the garret and in the storehouse. This is in Coates Pen.
Mm-hmm.
And this word Osnaburg refers to a fabric that was
Yes.
used
So
for clothing,
enslaved workers.
enslaved
Yeah,
workers.
yeah.
So that's interesting.
So it's
And then all-
also interesting that the sundries are in the storehouse at Coates Pen, and it's strong enough to put your plate in there, your gold rings and seals and silver watch. It's strong enough to hold your documents that show you've got a share in 2 ships and a sloop. It's strong enough to hold your cash and your bonds and your evidence of debts that you have. So why isn't that at the biggest plantation, which was Denby? Anyway.
It's really interesting because Coates Pen is quite close to Denby in reality.
Yeah.
So it could be that the house that we've been looking for at Denby was actually at Coates Pen. And certainly with that and 16 guns. Yes.
Yes, just to confirm, this is Barrington.
Hello,
Greetings,
Barrington.
everybody.
Welcome,
Just
Barrington.
to confirm that there is a waterworks in Frankfield,
yes, yes, yes.
in Clarinda,
That's correct. That's correct.
northwestern of the parish.
How Frankfield is not that far from Pennant, is it?
No, no.
No, it's not. No.
7 miles.
So that's really
Yes.
interesting that that area there may be. I'm glad you've joined us, Barrington. This is wonderful. Barrington Richardson's the Director of Education in Clarendon. And we're saying, Barrington, it's really important that we get a Clarendon Historical Society so that this information can be shared and information can come back from the reality of living in Clarendon and knowing the places and the stories. So thank you very much indeed, Barrington. That's brilliant. So
Yeah, so this document that I came across has actually raised more questions, although it's given us some good answers. I was unaware that the Pennant family had a house in Spanish Town. It's probably not unusual, and they clearly didn't appear in the page above having any staff there. But there's plate linen and sundries there. And then, as Vivian pointed out, in Westmond, there was a substantial workforce. Well, that is the Kings Valley plantation. So having clarification about waterworks is really helpful, because I did begin to wonder when I thought that it might be Denby, whether the information had just been represented incorrectly. But that is the exact order of the information on the document that I found. So Edward has really worked hard during his tenure to get these plantations not only going, but productive. And he's also provided for his family in the expansion of the business that his father started. Now, he had a large family. He had at least 9 children, and they were clearly highly thought of in society. Because when I look at the children and who they married, it's quite significant. So the eldest was Sarah, and she married Thomas Rodon, who was a large plantation owner. They had a son called Gifford, named after his grandfather. Sadly, he died young. Their daughter Elizabeth married the Honourable Edward Dawkins. Their daughter Mary married John Morant, who was Custos of Clarendon and Vere at one point. Their daughter Smart married first Thomas Peters, who was part of the Assembly. When he married, when he died, she remarried the Reverend William May. There's a poignant little story about Smart because she died at the age of 23, sheltering from a hurricane, and the house she was sheltering in collapsed on top of her. William broke his leg and she lost her life, unfortunately. And then we have the 4 sons of the family being born. John, who is going to be the next instalment, comes first, and then Samuel, and then Henry, who all survive to an age, and finally a son called Edward, who unfortunately, according to Edward's will, was not totally compos mentis. It wasn't in his full senses, and he makes provision for him in the will.
Shall I switch this off now, Leslie, and then you can see who's joined us? Thank you, that's wonderful.
Incidentally, the total value of that estate in Edward's time was £41,000, and today that has a value of £9 million. So he's certainly improved upon his father's work and made a potentially great life for him and his children out in Jamaica. And we'll see how that changes in the next instalment next week.
Well, Leslie, thank you very much indeed. And Vivian, you've got your hand up. Don't know if this is from before or...
Yes, I was saying that I got the information. It's
Oh.
not Waterworks in Clarendon, it's Waterwell, which is a mile from Race Course in Clarendon, and it's 12 miles from Denby.
Right. So Waterwell
is near to Race Course in southern Clarendon. Waterwell.
So there isn't a place called
Waterworks. Waterworks in Jamaica. Well, there are 2 spaces. In Westmoreland, Waterworks, that's the name of a district. And in Kingston, near Manor Park, is a community called Waterworks.
So the big question is, why do they appear on Edward Pennant's inventory and will?
Waterworks.
Yeah, why are they in his will?
Because he would have plantations all over. What I understand, the slave masters, they wherever there was a bargain, they were in it, so they had plantations all over.
Yeah,
we're being very specific.
They don't appear after this, and then Denby is named.
Yes.
You see my point?
Yes.
So one of the fascinating things, excuse me, is that we're looking at Denby Plantation being a heritage site. So we really need to explore this story. Excuse me.
Question. I feel guilty that this presentation...
I'm sorry.
Who's that?
May I interject a little just to add to what is being said about Waterwell? There is a well in the racecourse Kemsill area, and they developed a scheme called Waterworks scheme, named after the well that supplies water to neighboring communities. But there is a name of a community as Waterworks in Frankfield.
In Frankfield?
Sorry. There is a well on maps of Denby.
But Barry's now saying they're going to Frankfield too.
So Vivian, there's a little task for you.
Well, it's exciting, but before you reach that, I was saying to Les that I feel very guilty that, say, University of the West Indies and the Sixth Formers Association of Jamaica, whether they're doing medicine or history or architecture, they're not hearing this presentation.
This is
because
why we're recording it, Vivian. This is why we're recording it, Vivian. And on a new website, it'll be possible for people to chime into this.
It is incredible. It is just incredible. Because I hasten to ask, Leslie spoke earlier about the formation of an assembly. Then she said, and this has always intrigued me, each parish has a vestry. And I grew up knowing that before our ancestors' names were recorded in the Island Registrar General, it was in the church vestry in the records. Mm-hmm. And I recall people who were going to England in the Windrush and they didn't have birth certificates. They went to the church, and the church, for some reason, never destroyed the records. And the pastor, the minister, could sign, the government took it, signed by a minister that that person was born on such a date because they were christened, baptized in the church. So the question is, where was the administration of the country? In the assembly or in the church vestry where the meeting was in? I am just confused there.
Maybe you can find the answer for me.
No, but you see, in the vestry, I thought it had to do with the administration of the church.
It was based on an old English system. We had that same system here, and it was a church system.
Okay, it was the church, the administration of the church. Mm-hmm. Okay, the vestry is the administration of the church. Yes. Didn't have to do with the community.
That was separate.
Okay.
Vivian, I'm not sure if you were online when we shared this really interesting. Let me just.
No, I didn't see that.
Okay.
I was trying to check
now,
in.
This is brilliant, and this is a gift that Leslie's giving to us, because this book, Historic Jamaica, written by the Secretary and Librarian of the Institute of Jamaica, this is a publication from 1915. So with due deference, Vivian, I don't think this was quite in your time, but it would have been in your predecessor's time. And this Historic Jamaica book is available online, and you can read it online.
I have a copy.
Oh, you have a copy? Oh, come on, get it off the shelf and show us then.
I have a copy.
Have you read it?
Here in my house.
Have you read it?
Of course, every day I have to consult it. And Condell, you should know.
You're so clever.
Sorry, Condell was the first executive director of the Institute of Jamaica. Frank Condell. He was the first executive director of the Institute of Jamaica.
Right.
And his son was Solicitor General of Jamaica. The memorial to Frank Condell, the memorial to Frank and his son are in St. Andrew Parish Church, Jamaica, the memorial tablets. So we have a Condell. When you enter the Institute of Jamaica, you will see a massive memorial to Frank Condell. He died 1937.
Right. So it's a
priceless book, yes.
Yeah. So it's available online now, which is...
Yes, well, thank you very much for that. But and a copy is at the National Library of Jamaica.
Yes.
And I have a copy, oops.
It's a very valuable piece of reading
information, yes, indeed.
Guard it with your life, Vivian.
Yes.
Book.
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, that's just brilliant. And the conversation at the end has been really wonderful. So we're going to wrap up in a moment or two with the formal part of this, and we'll ask Simon to stop recording. Simon, are you still with us?
Simon? I am indeed. So just give the words.
Well, thank you very much, Simon, for doing all the techie side of things. Ivor, thank you so much for joining us early and giving us a chance to be able to share a little bit with you earlier. Biggest thanks to Leslie, who pulled this presentation together. Absolutely magnificent, Leslie. And it's really interesting, and we're so aware that we've got access to this information over here, and we want to make sure we share it with our colleagues in Jamaica. We're specifically looking at history of the Pennant family. So over to you, Vivian, before we
Yes, sorry. I'm a bore. Leslie, you spoke about the Royal African Company, and we have been speaking about the Queen Anne's Bounty.
Yes.
So wonder if that was a part of it, the Queen Anne's Bounty, because that money, some 10 million pounds now in the Archbishop of Canterbury's office. They have a commission there that they want to do some reparation thing. That has been going on. I nearly said 1066 because I approached them to get some funding for a cause, and nothing came out of it. For the restoration of the Myco building, the Sir Thomas Fowell Buxton building is in disrepair, and the impression I get that might be done in 2099. They will look at it. So
They're not in a great rush.
it's beautiful. I've never heard it said that way.
This bureaucracy takes time.
Well, it's Max Weber who had no hope in bureaucracy, because it is said that the Rome was not built in a day because it was a government contract.
Wow.
Very good.
I like that one. Well, on that gorgeous note, I'm going to say this is the formal bit, so Simon can
Yes.
stop the recording and then we can carry on chatting and catching up.
Sure.